I have just read in a couple of days the book, the WikiLeaks files, and I must say I'm very impressed by the level of detail and the level of information that's been drawn out of the cables. And I remember that at one time in the past you did say to me that you were very cognizant of the fact that a lot of information was just being spat out by the mainstream traditional media and the bigger story wasn't being told. Do you think that this is the book that tells the bigger story for you?
I think so. It is this structure of relationships. What the media concentrated on was just one individual in one individual cable. But it's much more interesting to look at the structure of relationships between the United States and the countries that it deals with, and even between those countries in a particular region. Actually, that kind of approach, a sort of constellation approach, is not unusual in academic research of foreign relations. And it was a bit of a mystery to me why in English very little of that research was done in relation to our ongoing cable publications. Some of you might not be aware, but there was the 251,000 cables that we published in late 2010 and throughout 2011. But subsequently, we've gotten hold of a lot more, including 500,000 this year, bringing the total up to 2.7 million. That's 30,000 volumes of internal state literature, 2 billion words, and that is overwhelmingly the largest library of modern foreign relations that exists. So it is the corpus for the study of international relations, and it's used every day. For example, just today in the British press here, you must remember it's early in the morning here, but just today, both the Guardian and the Daily Mail have picked up a story that arises from our Saudi cables, which was first published in the Australian just a couple of days ago, that the UK offered a special deal to Saudi Arabia to stick them on the Human Rights Council. And Saudi Arabia is now head of the UN Human Rights Council, as absurd a result as you can possibly imagine. Thanks to that, Saudi offered also a bribe to the UK and a number of other countries, as we've discovered, of $100,000 to help, as they put it, help the UK campaign to be on the Human Rights Council. But part of the deal was offered by the UK of a vote swap. So things are continuing on, but those individual stories, it's very easy, if you like, to lose track of the structure of great power as a result of all these small stories. In some ways, you can even drown in the plethora of detail of individual cases. So it's necessary to take this higher level, more holistic approach and see what 30,000 cables in a particular region say about these type of relationships. I'm very happy to hear Linda Pearson there, which I didn't know she would be there, since she's normally based in Sydney. But after engaging these 17 authors to regional specialists to bite off particular regions and understand those relationships, I thought something was missing. And I worked out what it was after reading some of Linda's writing about the ICC, which was the structuring principles of the modern world and how the US runs its very modern empire don't simply include the relationships between countries or regions. A lot of that structuring occurs at the international institutional level. And the ICC is a really good example of that because its mandate is so well defined, going after war crimes and crimes against humanity and arresting people, clearly defined, and the opposition to it by successive US administrations is also clearly documented in the cables. And that draws out how the United States government gets what it wants when it wants something. In this particular case, it was immunity from the ICC. And you can think about what class of people wanted immunity. Was it for the average person? Well, of course not. It was for the principal decision makers in the Bush regime, the people in the CIA and people in the Pentagon. They wanted immunity. They're close enough to government where they can grab the levers of government and coerce the State Department into doing its bidding. And so how it got what it wanted in many cases was taking this carrot and stick approach, the carrot being increased military cooperation. You'll get into the good books of the United States. And the stick being, well, that will be cut off. Various forms of aid programs and so on will be cut off. And you'll get into the US bad books. Interestingly, there's quite a realpolitik approach comes across in that ICC chapter with some of the countries. So the governments would come in and go, well, look, the problem is that we think that there's not enough carrot in what you're doing. And so the US would redesignate previous aid programs, which was already engaging in, or which had already been signed to occur in the future, to look as if they had been measures which were introduced as a result of this bilateral immunity.
Indeed. You say that diplomatic cables are not produced to manipulate the public. I think it's a really good point in the book. These cables were actually written to be read by other people who were not the public. The fact that reading them is a much more effective way of understanding institutions like the State Department rather than reading reports by journalists on the public pronouncements of Hillary Clinton. Can you explain to me how that works? What do you mean by that? You're saying that these cables actually have a special place which actually
That's right.
peels away some of the levels of nuance, some of the levels of the sophistry that goes on, and some of the lies that are told as well.
It's part of my philosophy for a long time in why internal state literature or internal company literature is really important, because it wasn't designed to manipulate history. It wasn't designed to manipulate the public. Of course, it's designed to manipulate people, but it's designed to manipulate people within inside the apparatus. And because it's designed to manipulate a different audience, its ability to manipulate you as a reader is decreased. It's also usually designed for a particular window of time, and with the increasing distance of time, one can look at it afresh and not be so easily fooled. Of course, there are all kinds of orthodoxies and forms of political correctness that happen when an ambassador writes back to Washington. An ambassador wants to stand out for the right reasons and not the wrong reasons, and cables are written along those lines. But those orthodoxies and diplomatic political correctness of the day are themselves quite interesting and really quite recognizable for an outsider or with the perspective of time.
Let me ask you this. The problem is that some academic institutions won't use the information contained in the WikiLeaks cables. The International Studies Quarterly, US-based academic journal, won't accept manuscripts based on WikiLeaks material. What do you think of that, denying access to information because of its source?
Well, there's censorship and self-censorship that has occurred in the academic class in English in the United States and to a lesser degree in the UK. It's a fascinating story. I wasn't aware of it in general terms until writing the introduction for this book. And I was aware of many other forms of censorship, self-censorship by the New York Times and so on, but they publish some. Every day something in the US press is published. There's a lot of censorship in relation to selectivity, but they do actually publish some material. And so I thought, well, I need to show what's the point of an introduction at all. What you want to show is how it's novel and why people should read it. And of course, everyone's aware of WikiLeaks' work and WikiLeaks cables. Excuse me, there's some kind of alarm going off here, but everyone's aware of WikiLeaks' work and WikiLeaks cables have been coming out over a long period of time. So I want to show why people should read the book and not simply rely on the newspaper stories that they may have heard of. Well, it's no surprise that newspaper journalists kind of work in a manner where they don't invest very much. It's a rapid response. Something's in the news, they search for some information in our material, they grab it, and they publish a little bit. There's no kind of systematic analysis. Okay, but, well, shouldn't have all that appeared in academic books? Shouldn't have all that appeared in academic papers? And so there's academic search engines such as scholar.google.com, which search court filings and academic records. There's about 30,000 papers and court filings derived from WikiLeaks. For example, at the European Court of International Rights, a famous El Masri case, which considered the kidnapping of a German citizen, El Masri, by the CIA, case of mistaken identity, held for over 4 months, tortured, and then dumped on the streets of Albania. 6 of our cables are cited in his successful European Human Rights Court case against Macedonia. Lots of things like that occurring. Lots of sightings in academic literature in Asian languages, in Asian language journals. Lots of citations in Spanish language journals. Many citations in English language journals, even journals based in the United States, even written by US authors outside the field of international relations. For example, in conflict epidemiology, where the war logs have become one of the defining data sets, defining corpuses to experiment on in understanding how a conflict progresses and looking at it like a disease spreading across a population. But not foreign relations. It didn't make any sense. It didn't make any sense because how is it that other US journals feel that they are legally safe enough to publish papers written by US academics, just as long as they're not in the field of foreign relations? And so we looked into this, and it's quite an interesting story that you see in the introduction of the US government emailing every single US government, about 30 million people, every single US government employee, every single US government contractor, saying you must delete any stories derived from WikiLeaks or from WikiLeaks in your machine, setting up firewalls of quite Byzantine types across the Department of Education and others, leading to a sort of neo-McCarthyist hysteria, which dissipated from other academic disciplines over time, but is still there in the field of foreign relations and international politics. Why is it still there? Well, these have a proximity to the US State Department. Many of the professors are essentially in feeder schools for the US State Department, for the CIA and other internationally oriented parts of government. And we managed to get an admission by the editor of International Studies Quarterly, which is the premier foreign relations journal in the United States, saying they have a policy to never accept anything derived from WikiLeaks classified publications, ever. And that the editors, and far from saying this with pride, saying that the editors were in an invidious position, because this was a policy of an overarching organization, which publishes another 4 big foreign relations journals. So it draws you to an interesting place, which is, from a personal perspective, as the editor of WikiLeaks, well, I'm rather pissed off about that, because part of my responsibility is to get maximum impact for our sources. across a range of media, and that includes in academic literature. But it's not just about WikiLeaks. Obviously, the same self-censorship and censorship that occurs in the scholar class is not just affecting us, because the reasons for it are not just about us. It's something that has been going on, presumably, for at least 40 years because of that proximity. And so there's a whole, you can imagine as we go through history, academics build up a surface of papers which study the world and study how foreign relations and international politics has actually occurred and derive theories from it. Okay, but in reality, there's a giant sinkhole in this surface that we haven't seen before. We've just managed to get a concrete glimpse of it as a result of this censorship of WikiLeaks. So we know that this perceived surface in relation to WikiLeaks publications is carved out, and there's a giant sinkhole. If you try and walk across the world using academic literature as an understanding, you will fall into this hole. But presumably it goes back 40 years in relation to a whole range of other taboos that occur in the US, UK scholar class, which is the dominant academic class in relation to the leadership of academic research in the field of international relations.
And what the WikiLeaks cables do, in part and largely at times, is to undercut a lot of the theories and the analysis that's been done by people who've built their careers on these ideas.
Yeah, this debate is ongoing. The introductory chapter was picked up by by a member of the ISQ, by a member of the ISA, International Studies Association, which interestingly, in DC terms, is felt to be fairly left. Anyway, it was picked up by someone, academic close to Washington, who writes for Washington Post, as in a kind of preemptive defense of it, then started a debate. And as a result of that, a number of people in think tanks in DC came forward and said, yes, in our think tank, we censor WikiLeaks cables. And I've had to self-censor, and I know people who have self-censored, and we have a fear of not getting government jobs because our security clearance classification review might eliminate them, or we will lose our security clearance, and so on. So there's a patronage system in terms of money flow for jobs. Part of an ingredient of that is security clearances. So we had to write this book as an alternate. Now, there have actually been decent books written in Spanish, Italian, Russian, but not before in English. Very, very, very interesting that English it's a bigger market. The cables are very accessible in English because they're written in English. So we had to do it ourselves.
Well, maybe you've touched on a point there that in fact it's an English cartel of information sharing organisations that actually have had, I suppose, at one level, the executive government the most to lose, although the population may be the most to win. But if I could just ask you this, look, if we delve into the cables, what comes through is the language. It's changed, or it's used in a way to suit political argument. Is it simply black or white? People are either good guys or bad guys. Who's a terrorist? Who's fighting a just war? Waterboarding, in fact, is it a torture, or has it become an enhanced interrogation technique? Political prisoners or enemy combatants? Is this language necessary just to justify the actions that follow?
Well, I think it's necessary in terms of cables because they're not meant for the public. It's necessary for internal cohesion. I mean, no organization, including the US State Department, wants to feel that its mission is basically immoral. No one wants to feel that.
So they use the language to cover their own.
So they use a euphemistic language. For example, states which attempt to keep control of their own resources and extract rents for foreign companies, big giant oil companies like Chevron coming in and taking those resources. That's described by the US State Department fairly uniformly as resource nationalism, rather than, say, basic sovereignty or people trying to keep their economy afloat. And you see that kind of euphemistic language throughout the cables, because some of it resonates with public language, because some of it is taken from the public, some of it is then pushed into the public, not through cables, but through statements by the public statements by the State Department. You do have to be a little bit careful, but it's fairly obvious stuff once you put it in context. Interestingly, if we extend outside the cables, and this book, I suppose I should hold it up.
There are in fact books for sale at the back of the auditorium here after this session's over. You'll be glad to know.
It does, it's what we would call in the intelligence world, it is an all-source intelligence book. That means, yes, the dominant archive is our 2.7 million cable archive, but it does actually source, at least the best chapters do, source across WikiLeaks' general archive, which is more than 10 million documents now, from a wide variety of other places. And I'll give you an example of one of those, which is what I think is the single most significant document that we have released. It is the US Manual for Unconventional Warfare. It's active policy doctrine even now. It was created in 2008. It's the doctrine for US Special Forces for when they are overthrowing a government. So there's another one we also released called Foreign Internal Defense. That's when you're trying to support a government with US Special Forces from being overthrown. This is how to overthrow a foreign government in order to achieve US policy objectives. And there is an absence of that euphemistic language. It is like it is written by the evil Noam Chomsky. So the same kind of description of the US state that Noam Chomsky would give, but this is what we do, and that's what you must do. And that talks about the elements of US national power. And when the US government wants to achieve a particular objective, bringing together all the elements of US national power, the intelligence element of US national power, the diplomatic element of US national power, the commercial element of US national power, the law enforcement element of US national power, the informational element of US national power, and the financial element of US national power, and pulling them all together in a seven-way pincer maneuver to force a government or people into doing something. And that includes US Special Forces. So this is written for elite intellectual soldiers who work using surrogate forces. So they don't just go into a country and shoot guns. They go into a country, find allies against the government, train them up, ideologically indoctrinate them, organize them, give them supply lines, and help them take down the government. And a key aspect of that is the Department of State and US embassies. And Special Forces teams are led, in a formal sense, by the US ambassador in that particular country, if there is diplomatic relations occurring.
Of course, the problem that the United States and other governments have is that if they bring their children up to be decent, honest, truthful people, and they want that of their children, when they then go out into the world and learn that the government, as Edward Snowden did, was not behaving in the way that he thought was appropriate, thought was in breach of the American Constitution. As a constitutionalist, he actually pointed that out. Do you think that that is part of the conundrum that particularly the United States has got when people like Snowden and Manning come out and say, well, this is nonsense, what we're seeing, these are lies that are being told, this is an illegal war and I want no part of it? and that you won't be able to stop that. In other words, no matter how many highly trained guerrilla fighters you've got going in there blasting people away or assassinating people, if you can't solve that major problem of being truthful and of you like distorting the truth, that people will turn against it. And that there will be more people,
yes,
more people like you, more people like Ed
there's
Snowden, more people like Manning.
as to why we have received more information from US whistleblowers than from other whistleblowers. We have from around 100 countries. So it's not like there aren't others in other countries, but in terms of sheer proportions, okay. Well, number one, we're an English-based organization, so it's going to be dominant English. The United States is the largest English-speaking country.
Yeah, but also the United States is an English-speaking country, and it's the English-speaking countries that unite in this intelligence sharing arrangement the most powerful.
Yeah, and we shouldn't actually perceive that US, Canada, UK, and New Zealand and Australia are different countries. They are at a deep structural level in terms of intelligence agencies and diplomacy, the same country. It may come as a shock to you, but we have released, for example, that's even a self-description. We have released details of combined operations, for example, Operation Empire Challenge, which is an Anglo-American Australian intelligence military fusion operation where you fuse together all these assets, space assets, ground assets, and so on, in order to, in this case, carry out an occupation, a test occupation. And it's called Operation Empire Challenge because it's simulating operating in Iraq. There's a challenge to the empire. That is their own internal description of this integrated network of the English, white, Christian-derived countries, a relatively cohesive empire. Sorry.
No, that's the point. My point was simply not only that, which you make very clear.
So, no, very, very important commonality between Manning and Snowden. I haven't spoken about it before. Completely unrecognized by everyone else. Manning, who's alleged to be the source of some of our cables, he was an all-source intelligence analyst. What does that mean? It means he had a top-secret security clearance and access to all the intelligence source material that the US, as the Pentagon, was coming in. That's why he allegedly had access to US diplomatic cables. How does that make sense? He's an intelligence analyst in Iraq. Why would he have access to working for the Pentagon? Why would he have access to State Department material? Because he was an all-source intelligence analyst. And that means pulling together a wide variety of intelligence assets and open source intelligence and using it to understand the situation. Now, Edward Snowden was not an all-source intelligence analyst, he was a system administrator. And what does that mean? Well, it means that in Hawaii, he was administering a number of systems of the National Security Agency, controlling the basic computer systems. Now, you have all sorts of different analysts using these basic computer systems, all sorts of different technicians. But in being someone who's responsible for, configuring the hard drives and the backups and so on, he had access to all the information that those systems had, which is extremely wide variety of NSA information. And so he had a bird's eye view of what the National Security Agency was up to. Similarly, Manning had a bird's eye view of what the US intelligence agencies, and particularly the Pentagon, was up to. As a result, Manning could see the systematic injustice surrounding the US wars of occupation. And as a result, Edward Snowden could see the systematic breaching of the Constitution in relation to the National Security Agency's surveillance activities. That's not true. for an average soldier, not even an average intelligence analyst. That's not true for an average employee of the National Security Agency, who are normally very compartmentalized. And even if they do have the security clearance to go out to other compartments, they don't have a legitimate excuse in their work to do so. Or their work is so, just in terms of amount of time, it bogs them down into some particular area. But there are plenty of system administrators, and there are also lots of these all-source intelligence analysts. But I think it is quite important that for both of these two cases, you have people who could see the woods for the trees. Not like most. They could actually see a wide survey of what was going on.
And this is because they were given access to that material as a result of what supposedly happened in 9/11, when the silos apparently were too rigid and...
Yeah, that was the policy that came up after 9/11. A policy had been pushed by one of my friends, John Perry Barlow, who started the EFF and who co-started the Freedom of Press Foundation with me in the US. And we were horrified about, but it was to remove these silos, the competition between the FBI and the CIA and so on, who were jealous competing institutions. That was a terrible thing to do, to remove that silo, because it really is, that's what keeps the state honest, is that various actors have bargaining power within the state, organizations, individuals, unions, etc. Now, if you've got a number of different security bodies, FBI, CIA, Pentagon, and Department of State, and these bodies are competing for allegiances, then when you get screwed around by one of them, you can say, well, I'm going to sort of help and favor the other. Now, a really concrete policy, an effective policy of merging these organizations occurred. It wasn't just, well, you guys should cooperate. No, they put in various incentives for this to happen, and even started playing musical chairs in the senior management. For example, Petraeus going from the Pentagon to the CIA. Hayden going from CIA to NSA. So that started to merge those organizations. For the State Department, its budget was moved under the general national security budget. An extraordinary thing for what was an independent point of diplomatic power in the United States to be moved in under the security budget. Same thing with USAID, the US National Aid Program, also moved in under the security budget.
But the breaking down of the silos and the sharing of information means that people that wouldn't normally have had access to that big picture would have been kept in the dark, a need-to-know basis, and we would never have known the things that Baddeley Manning and Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden told us about. So in fact, you could argue it's actually to the benefit of us all that this thing has broken down.
Maybe. Maybe. I mean, it's to the benefit of organizations like WikiLeaks, for sure. And it is, I mean, even the US government says this is the reason that Manning had access to a lot of cable material, is that he was able to, yes, that all sorts Pentagon intelligence analysts had access to US government cables. But this the pyramidization of the US security structure, I think is a really very concerning structural change within the United States.
One of the threads that come through the book to me is that the United States is an empire that's grown not so much by military force. It hasn't occupied lands, but it's occupied countries through its trading arrangements that it's made. What's your view on that?
Well, so we kind of detailed in the book that the US empire is a modern empire. It's not like the Ming Dynasty. It's not like the Roman Empire.
The Spanish Empire.
Even different to the British Empire, although the British Empire was on the way to what the United States is doing. It's a modern empire, and it operates in a modern fashion. There is a land element to the US empire, let's not forget. There is a classical element. Up until really up until World War II, the US was proceeding as a traditional empire. First of all, the occupation of the entire continental United States, its doubling expansion of territory into Mexico, its acquisition of Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Alaska, and so on. But after that, it really is, I think, a shift in the decolonialization process. So you had the European colonial powers quite weak after World War II, but the United States didn't want to come into direct conflict with them. And so you then have a sort of a covert empire, an empire of free trade, or what we would, would normally be referred to as a hegemony, where the United States embassy is very large and it has special deals and unusual influence within a country, and is able to extract all sorts of economic and military concessions. And another way of describing it is, because that's often quite hard to work out, you can see it in, say, special deals that the US gets in relation to loans or foreign currency debt, which would be completely unsustainable for any other country that wasn't in that hegemonic relationship. But we can look at it maybe perhaps in a more classical extent with a number of US military bases around the world and special forces training. So special forces, the number of US military bases and special forces, well, there's more than, they're present in more than 120 countries around the world. Between 800 and 1,400 US military bases, permanent bases, depending on how you count them. To give you a comparison, Russia, which is the next highest count, has 12. 11 of those are in its immediate border region, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and so on, Kaliningrad. One is outside of that, which is in Syria. It's part of the geopolitical situation that is occurring in Syria. It's the final pin on that board, final Russian base outside of the, Russia's immediate region is in Syria.
I just like
so that's the most number of bases that any empire has ever had.
Outside the United States.
Well, any empire, the British Empire or the US Empire, the United States has more bases than any country that has ever existed.
So do you think it is essentially about trade, but it's the strategic importance of having bases is about tying people closely into you and about trade in the end, or is it about?
This leads to a really very fundamental question, which is, when the US government decides to do something, why does it decide that? What are the domestic influences or foreign influences that cause it to make decisions? And
I'd like to ask you about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, if you could.
Yeah, you can get a hint at that from looking at, for example, what had happened with the ICC. Well, there you had an executive class and a military and intelligence class who's close to government was able to grab the State Department and help push it to save their asses in this ongoing war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. Okay, so we know that and if you look at the response in this Edward Snowden fight, where we were fighting to get him asylum and to pull him out of Hong Kong, and the National Security Agency, CIA, State Department, White House were pushing in the other direction. They marshaled enormous assets. What was pushing it was National Security Agency, an intelligence class. So we know the intelligence class has, a military class, has unusual influence on decision-making that the US government does. But also it's the major US corporations that are close to government. Not all major US corporations. It's the ones that get close to government. Now, over time, all major US corporations do get close to government over time. The Google is right now in this transition period, where it's trying very hard to get close to government, and government is trying to get close to it. So that those major corporations are probably the single largest factor when trying to understand why the US government makes decisions. But there are also major institutions, such as the CIA, NSA, and so on.
So the Trans-Pacific Partnership fits into that quite closely.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of press recently. Right now, the TPP is being negotiated in Atlanta. Might be signed tomorrow. It's quite a.
So what is the difference then between
quite important time? But we look at
the difference between the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the trade deal with China. They're two separate.
For Australia.
Yes.
For Australia, you should understand that why the TPP has become. People can't remember a lot of acronyms. TPP is hard enough as it is, but there's a number that the United States is pursuing aggressively: TPP, TISA, and TTIP. TTIP is the US-EU economic and legal merger. TPP is US and Asia-Pacific region. TISA is 52 countries. It includes all those countries and a few more, pulling them together. It's part of, as it comes across from, as is sort of nakedly declared by Hillary and the US Defense Secretary. So Hillary said, TTIP is an economic NATO. That's a direct quote from Hillary from 2012. Ashton Carter, US Defense Secretary, said earlier this year, TPP is more important for the US rebalancing to Asia, which is the current vogue phrase for the encirclement of China, than another aircraft carrier. So these are strategic arrangements to try and create a new economic legal bloc, like Western Europe was created as a bloc, an integrated bloc, to economically and militarily offset the Soviet Union. So that's what's going on. China, having heard this kind of rhetoric for a number of years, interesting, it's not really in the popular press, but you read US policy documents, it's there nakedly. China, having heard this rhetoric, is going, well, we can't be economically encircled. We have to kind of start doing similar arrangements, trying to create these arrangements in the Asia-Pacific region. Otherwise, we're going to be locked out of what the United States is doing, and the Silk Road and so on. So for Australia, why they're at a economic sector by economic sector basis, there might be all sorts of problems for Australia in relation to Australian China Free Trade Agreement. No doubt there are, in terms of regulation and so on. That's very clearly the case in the TPP, which is much more invasive. But it's important for Australia, if it is going to go with both of these agreements, I think it should really try and extract many more concessions in relation to TPP, because that is a very invasive program that will really restrict the future development of Australian society for years to come. That it has a balance. It has bargaining power. It can play these agreements off each other. It can play these economic sectors off each other. It's only through a country and people and organizations having bargaining power that you get treated fairly.
Are you seriously suggesting that the Australian government would actually try to bargain China off against the United States?
Well, it doesn't seem to happen much. We should understand it as at a human, in terms of human society and what happens structurally within Canberra. It really is in the embrace of the United States in a very concerning way. But in terms of Australian business, which does have an influence on the government, something else is going on. Australian business wants those opportunities. Australian unions want those opportunities with Canberra. So there is a push in the other direction as well. You can even see that here in the United Kingdom, where something quite remarkable has happened, which is that the United Kingdom has become a member of the Asian Development Bank. And now it is possible, and the US has made some complaints about that, it is possible that's all a bit of a surface fiction, and that the US wants its man inside the Asian Development Bank to report back on what is happening. That's definitely the case in relation to the EU, for example, where the US very much wants the UK as part of the EU and has nakedly stated it's in order to have its influence via the UK in the EU. Maybe, I guess it's possible, I don't know, it is possible in relation to agreements within Asia that Australia is potentially part of, that the US sees it in the same way. Well, obviously it doesn't want Australia to go into the embrace of China, but it knows that's not going to happen. So it wouldn't be bad to have its man at the Chinese table.
Because it seems that Australia is getting closer militarily to the United States than ever before. And I mean, to the extent that Des Ball, a very noted strategic thinker, has called for Pine Gap to be shut, and for Australia to actually run its own surveillance systems, such as the intrusive nature of Pine Gap, and such in the way that it's used militarily as a forward attack platform for the United States military. Just to ask you this question, which is something that occupies people in this country very much, do you think that security, day-to-day security using telephones, using email, is there any way to avoid surveillance at all?
But for the average person, not really, using electronic communications. I mean, there's things you can do to make things harder, but unless you're an expert or have access to an expert, and even then, most of these are not guaranteed. Most of them are quite impractical. Yeah, you need expert advice, or to be an expert. So my suggestion is for journalists. I was asked this question last night, actually. It's a lot like our electronic voting. Security systems, programs you might install that say that you're going to encrypt your communications, for example. How do you know that they work? How do you know that they're not completely bogus and they're actually designed to suck out the good meat by having those people who are concerned about security install them? How do you know that they haven't been backdoored, not through the intent of the author, because the author has been hacked by the National Security Agency? It's impossible for a normal person to assess. They're just like electronic voting machines are impossible for a normal person to assess. They can be made in a secure way, but how do you know? And so that's why ballot boxes are good, because you can see the ballot going into the box, and you have a range of people there counting the ballots. So in terms of how journalists deal with their sources, the average journalist has got to proceed in a manner which they can personally assess is secure. And that is not meeting the source in the street somewhere at a cafe. That's not the right approach. It has no cover. You need cover. And cover is, for example, this very meeting, where there's a reasonable excuse for many people to turn up who are interested in this subject, and they can rub shoulders together. That's the appropriate form of cover that journalists and sources need to interact with each other, and they can do it in person.
So in other words, you go back to the way that people spoke to each other before we had the internet and even the telephone.
That's right, before the telephone. Post is still not bad. But, you need to be careful about CCTV cameras and so on, and DNA tracers, etc. But most of that you can assess yourself.
Now, Julian, you've been in the embassy now for more than 3 years. What is the state now of the Swedish government's decision? What have they decided to do? Are they coming to talk to you or not?
Well, it's interesting that you phrase the question that way. That's part of the propaganda war against WikiLeaks. The big case that we have spent the most amount of time on, the most amount of money on, and the other side has spent vastly the most amount of money on, is the US case. Pending prosecution, stated as such in court in the US earlier this year, involving over 100,000 pages of material in that pending prosecution that they say is active, ongoing, etc. That's the big case, where they've flown FBI agents around the world. And we are engaged.
That case has been covered, and I think that the question to you is really, people are greatly concerned about what's happening to you personally, and then in that sense of there could be some resolution to this issue. That's the good spirit in which it's asked.
The UK has said, regardless, the current state of affairs in relation to the Swedish case, which I don't think people necessarily should even call a case, it's formally a, quote, preliminary investigation, unquote. I have not been charged. I have been previously cleared in the entire matter.
Look, I think people are very aware of they're very aware, Julian, of what's gone on in the past, and and there's a lot of sympathy for you in this country. I just asked you that if you could brief us on the latest stages.
Well, the UK says that they'll arrest me anyway, regardless of what happens in Sweden. So, but you ask about Sweden. There has been no developments in terms of the, quote, preliminary investigation in 5 years. Nothing. Nothing at all. And that's a part of why the Swedish courts have said that the government has breached its duty in not pursuing the matter properly, not providing an excuse for why it's engaged in this stasis. There's a negotiation that is happening now between the governments of Ecuador and the government of Sweden as to should they make some agreement that will cover something or other, but it's a bit hard to understand diplomatic parameters. Everyone's saying there wouldn't be such agreement until next year. We're quite annoyed by that whole process because it gridlocks the domestic legal courts, really, because, if you like, the big boys are decking it out internationally, and the courts won't want to tread on the toes of an ongoing negotiation. So everything in Sweden is essentially in stasis for, I don't know, for a year while that diplomatic process occurs. What is happening at the UN is more significant. The UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention is a judicial body within the UN, and its panel of 5 judges have been deciding and investigating for last year as to whether I am arbitrarily detained or not. It's the only question that judicial body answers. Is someone arbitrarily detained, or are they not arbitrarily detained? The question about arbitrary detention, 2 components. Are they detained? And if so, is the detention arbitrary? So the UK government and the Swedish government say that I'm not even detained. That's their first argument. And that if I am detained, then it is not arbitrary. We say, well, all case precedent is that if someone is, that the definition of detention has to do with a spectrum relating to freedom of movement. And there's plenty of cases of people being detained in airports trying to apply for asylum. People being trapped in airports trying to apply for asylum. They're always free to go to a very limited number of countries, back to the country they came from, that they say is persecuting them, and those people are detained. That is established European jurisprudence. The situation for me here in terms of precedent is much better in that there has been a formal finding by a state in its formal process that yes, that I am a refugee, and so I have been awarded asylum as having been found to be a refugee, political refugee. So we're very confident that the UN will come out and say that I am arbitrarily detained. But there are all sorts of political pressures on that body, and presumably it needs to feel completely confident that it can handle all those political pressures. So there has been, the case has gone on for rather a long time within the UN. And it makes it quite difficult because if you try and go to other international forum, for example, European Court on Human Rights, there's a risk, and there's precedent on this, that the European Court of Human Rights will say that, well, this has been, in the process of being judged, the basic case, the basic question is in the process of being judged by another international tribunal, and therefore we're not going to hear it until the other international tribunal has finished hearing it. It's the same with mechanisms such as the UNHRC, which is accessible by something called the ICCPR. People in the Wheeler Centre might have heard of that, but it's basically an appeal mechanism that as individual one can take, not through the UK, is not recognise individual appeals, but Sweden has, and that a state, in this case Ecuador, could push to the UNHRC. But really, these mechanisms need the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention to have made a decision.
We're going to take some questions in a couple of minutes, Julian, but I'd just like to ask you the last question. In the years that you've been confined to the embassy, it seems to have been a very productive period for you. You seem to have turned out, I mean, as opposed to stopping you in your work, it just seems to have got more and more and more. Is that how you feel it?
Well, that's sheer bloody-mindedness on my part and the part of the other WikiLeaks staff to, well, I mean, screw them. We're not going to allow this to send out a general deterrent in relation to publishing. We want to set the opposite. We want to create a general incentive. Look, even if they do this to you, the standard is you keep going. It has created extra difficulties. Yes, actually, we have published more in terms of absolute volume, in terms of number of systems, in terms of number of books, while I've been in this embassy, than in the time outside of it. I don't think, by any stretch of the imagination, my circumstance here has made me more efficient. It has given me nothing else to do, but as time goes by, an organisation becomes more efficient because the staff know what their abilities are, and you go to the person who's the best at something and so on, and you create structures which are efficient. So that's what you're seeing. I don't want to downplay the seriousness of having 100 full-time equivalent admitted police around me right now in the surveillance operation, which the UK government has admitted they have spent £12 million on so far in the last 3 years. £12 million, a few thousand just in the time that we have been speaking they have spent on that operation. GCHQ is also proven to be involved as a result of Snowden publications. The National Security Agency is documented having me on a man-hunting list since 2009. So there's a lot going on. It is a very difficult environment. But I think it is important, as the British say, to keep calm and carry on.
Great. Thanks very much, Julian. Thank you.
I want to give you a bit of the flavour
Wait
of...
for the questions now.
There's been really quite interesting political developments in this country with the election of Corbyn as Labour leader. Corbyn in 2011 stood up before the UK Parliament and said, I'll paraphrase, that it was outrageous that anyone be extradited without charge from the United Kingdom. Extradition without charge, this is not something that's acceptable to do, as is evidenced in this case of Julian Assange. And a month ago came out a New Statesman essentially repeating those comments in relation to me. So that's an interesting shift in British politics. I don't know whether Mr. Corbyn will succeed as Labour leader. There's plenty of nasty people in the Labour Party. That extradition debate, which I attended in 2011, the single most aggressive parliamentarian pushing for extradition to the United States of me and others was from Labour. Was from the former Blair minister. So he has many problems to deal with in that party, but
he may have also lots of
whatever
problems
dynamics.
when the Colcott inquiry comes out.
Yeah,
the inquiry into Iraq.
The dynamics that led to him being elected and led to that 350% growth in the members and supporters of the Labour Party. Those dynamics here within the United Kingdom are relevant to the situation I have. If you look on the other side of politics, I want to read you a section from the European chapter in this book, which is about the current supposed leaders of this country. David Cameron, the Prime Minister, George Osborne, the Treasurer, William Hague, who was the Foreign Minister in dealing with me in this embassy, and is now the Tory, until very recently was the Tory House of Commons leader. And this is a report from the US ambassador back to DC after having met with Hague. And it's in the early stages of their approach to this new British government. Hague said he, David Cameron, and George Osborne were, quote, children of Thatcher and staunch Atlanticists. For his part, said Hague, he has a sister who is American, spends his own vacations in America, and like many similar to him, considers America, quote, the other country to turn to. Asking his senior advisor her views, she said, this is Hague's senior advisor, America is the essential country. Hague said, and this is relevant to Corbyn, Hague said, whoever enters 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister soon learns of the essential nature of the relationship with the United States. He added, quote, we want a pro-American regime. We need it. The world needs it. I mean, what an incredible suck. What a sycophant.
Pretty mega. A mega
or what a glad handler. What a obvious manipulator of the American ambassador. And Hague's he's a smart guy. You know, he's a smart, experienced guy. He does this because he knows he needs to do that. Why would that be expected of the forthcoming British government? Why is it necessary for Hague to make these statements? Surely there's all sorts of things to speak about with the US ambassador. Is it really necessary to so conspicuously lick the navel of the US ambassador? We have to assume that it is, because Hague is an intelligent man, and he's not going to waste his time doing something that's not important.
Well, there was a story published in the British News recently, I'm sure you're aware of it, which quoted an unnamed military source saying that there would be a coup or worse to that effect if Corbyn were elected. Now there was
I said that just a few days before, actually, and I was rather surprised to be vindicated within a few days.
So are you the source? Yes. Are you the source of this story?
Well, I hate to think that that sitting general heard what I was saying and went, oh, well, it's perfectly acceptable to say Assange is saying it. But no, that's my understanding of what the reality is. Not that there's guaranteed to be a coup against Corbyn. I didn't say that. And neither did that sitting general. It's that if he has the policies of decreasing the relationship with NATO and scrapping Trident, then that's what's going to happen. And the sitting general quite remarkably and really very disturbingly came out and said that there would be a quote, mutiny, unquote, resignations, and that by, quote, fair means or foul, unquote, that the UK military would take action to have him removed.
And under different circumstances, there would be an inquiry. I would have thought the Daily Mail may have been calling for an inquiry and heads on platters with a statement like that, but there's been, from my understanding, absolutely no response whatsoever.
Well, not only has there not been an inquiry, there has been a consideration of whether there should be an inquiry and a refusal to conduct an inquiry with the excuse from the Ministry of Defence that, and you know, journalists will laugh at this, that it would be too hard to find out which general it was. There's 100, so that's a good start. There's only 100 of these guys, and you just look at the telephone records and who's been visiting that journalist or speaking to them and who was overseas, who was in London around that time period. I reckon it'd be pretty easy to get it down to 5, just using that kind of analysis.
We do have a question from the audience, I think. We do.
Hi, Julian. This question actually comes via Twitter from Andrew Bock. And he asks, how do Australians best help your release and also address surveillance issues in Australia?
Well, the best way of addressing surveillance issues in Australia is to campaign for my release, I think. Because then I could come to Australia and campaign on the issue. Well, I think it is really hard. I'm going to say something that my fellow anti-surveillance activists will hate, which is, it is a lost cause. The pace at which technology is increasing means that the capacity to surveil for the same budget is increasing something like 50% a year. So, or doubling every few years. That's the reality. And what has made the real constraint on the number of telephone interceptions, say, per year in Australia has simply been the cost of doing it. And that's why we're seeing all these, why we're seeing extensive mass surveillance now, simply because it's become so cheap to do. The mass surveillance, the technology is complex, it's invisible, it's not possible to meaningfully audit it unless there's serious political will that hires technicians to do surprise audits. I don't believe that over time there is the political will to do that. There may be political will at a moment. We might be able to generate a moment of doing that and erect some standard, but it will eventually decay. All the various oversight bodies in the United States and Australia historically have been captured by the very organisations they're meant to be conducting oversight over. That's not a surprise. They get classified briefings constantly from those bodies. They don't get briefings all the time from bodies outside. They're not able to check what they're hearing because it's said to be classified with others who are experts. So I think it is a lost cause in terms of government oversight and regulation. But we must carry on in trying to get our regulation because the speed of the advance is only checked by placing hurdles in front of it. If you vacate the regulatory field, then it will be immediately occupied by the other side. But I think dealing with mass surveillance has to occur primarily at the technological level and in terms of how people manage themselves The Australian government is so embedded within the Five Eyes alliance and seems to be becoming ever more so that I think it is a lost cause. I think Australia as an independent state, all sorts of strange things happen in politics. For example, you'd never expect this election of Corbyn. But as far as can be predicted, I think Australia is a lost cause as a sovereign state. The reason is this. Technology has permitted greater integration at higher speed of Australia and the United States. More messages flow at a faster speed. There's also greater economic integration between the two countries. There's even greater human integration as a result of cheaper air flight. Australia speaks English. There's no barrier to entry for US intelligence services operating in Australia. They understand more or less the culture, and they almost completely understand the language. And in fact, the various Australian phrases, which I'm quite fond of, are diminishing at a very rapid rate in Australia. So even that barrier to understanding is diminished. So I understood this a few years ago, and my view became that we should understand that Australia is part of the United States. It is part of this English-speaking Christian empire, the centre of gravity which is the United States, the second centre of which is the United Kingdom, and Australia is a suburb in that arrangement. And therefore we shouldn't go, oh, it's completely hopeless, it's completely lost. Australian sovereignty, we're never going to get that back. We can't control the basic big regulatory structure, which we're involved in terms of strategic alliances, mass surveillance and so on. No, we just have to understand that our capital is Washington. The capital of Australia is DC. That's the reality. So when you're engaging campaigns, just engage directly with DC, because that's where the decisions are made. And that's what I do, and that's what WikiLeaks does. We engage directly with DC, we engage directly with Washington, and that's what Australians should do. We have this electronic globalization. You can read all their newspapers, you can write letters to them, you can engage directly with all these institutions. Just do that, because that's where the decisions are made. They're not made in Australia.
Okay, thank you for taking my question, Julian. The Australian government should, in my opinion, be required by law to use every available legal means to get any of its citizens who are faced with unjust, indefinite imprisonment and worse, as in your case. Clearly, neither the federal government nor the Victorian state Labor government have done a thing, have lifted a finger to end your persecution and get you back to Australia. I mean, they should demand that the British government escort you to the airport, put you on a plane back to Australia. They haven't done a thing. They haven't even raised your name in Parliament anywhere. Now, do you think that this should be raised as an election issue? I would like to see every Labor, Liberal candidate, every minor party candidate asked, you know, what will they do to stop one of our citizens who has blown the whistle, who has told us the truth about the terrible wars in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere? What are they going to do to see that you're not thrown into jail like Chelsea Manning is? Thank you.
Well, thanks for that. Well, yes, the Australian government has done nothing. It has done nothing for years. Let's talk about, I mean, there's been just remarkable spin. This is not true for me, by the way. This is true for any Australian who gets into problems overseas where Canberra is trying to ingratiate itself with that government. Australia is notorious in the rest of the world for abandoning its citizens, not just me. Now, it does do more in certain, it does respond to the Australian public and the Australian media, and its degree of response is in proportion to the degree with which it feels it might be a problem in responding. In my case, because of this desire to constantly never offend the United States and to suck up to its structures, there has been complete abandonment. Now, the Australian public doesn't like that. It doesn't like it in other cases, it doesn't like it in my case. And so you then end up with a double talk from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. For example, Carr, when he was Minister of Foreign Affairs, said there had been more consular assistance for me than any other Australian during a comparable period. He admits in his own autobiography of that period, his own diary of that period, that that was a lie, that he just made it up because my mother called him on a radio station, and that he wanted to prick my confidence or something. That he says nakedly that he said that in order to needle my confidence, and that he hadn't done any such thing. There was a figure put out that there had been something like 81 consular contacts. When we heard this, me and my legal team and people around me, we just laughed and laughed and laughed. Because the only time we ever saw Australian consular officials was once when I was in prison, after enormous pressure in Australia. They sent someone in and they gave me a notepad. And then during the initial few days of the extradition case in December 2010, we saw them coming to court. They never spoke to us. They never gave us any information. They never assisted in any way. What they were doing was preparing a brief for the minister so he could be across the situation. Same in the Chelsea Manning case under Rudd, when Rudd was Foreign Minister. They secretly sent people from the Australian mission to Washington, D.C. to the Chelsea Manning case to create briefing notes for the minister. But they never sent us any of that material, legal analysis or observations. But that's the only consular contact we've had. That's it. So when they talk about these 80-something consular contacts, what they're talking about is one of our people sends an SMS message saying, can the Australian government do this? And they send back an SMS message saying, well, we would need to meet about that. We're considering it. No. Each one of these SMS messages is a, quote, consular contact, even setting up a meeting which never happens. And there hasn't even been one of those for several years.
Okay, thanks very much, Julian Assange, for spending the time with us this evening, giving us great insights into the way the world works, and particularly the role of the United States, and of course our little end of the world here in Australia.
There's a very interesting section on this book. We're talking about Australia as on the Asia-Pacific region, two sections actually on the Asia-Pacific. One, which I think is the most interesting, is on the relationship, this sort of three-way triangle between Japan, South Korea and the United States. That I think Australians will find that quite new, to see how the US plays off countries within the Asia-Pacific region, one against another.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Julian. Thank you.